Hi, thank you. And well, I'm the last one before lunch, so I'm trying to make it brief. So yeah, at Lexbyte, we are advising, we have two things. I'm a bank, I used to be a bank, I used to be a consultant, was at McKinsey, JP Morgan. And we're doing a little bit of those, both of those things, but in the crypto sector. So our view is cryptocurrency is here to stay, but it's going to become regulated. And it's going to go part of the mainstream. And in order to do that, you need to be compliant with the regulations. And you have securities token offerings. So we think this is the way to go. And this is what we're working on. Now, Jeff said, interestingly, before that in Europe, actually, at the moment, nothing is regulated. And we have a good case here where BaFin recently got pretty seriously slapped down by a German court, where they essentially fined someone who ran a securities token, who ran a Bitcoin exchange. And they wanted to fine them because they said, look, Bitcoin exchange is like a bank, you're running this thing, and you're sort of not, you're not supposed to. And recently the court came out and said, look, no, Bitcoin is like trading whatever, second-hand clothes. It's not a financial instrument. You have no business regulating it. Maybe you should be regulating it, but please, this is not, you need the legislator to deal with this and give you authorization. So that's the EU. On the other hand, decentralization, we are decentralized. This is actually really important on the US angle. And we had this comment recently from Mr. Hinman from the SEC, where he essentially said, look, Ethereum is not a security. And why is it not a security? Well, I think there's two arguments. He said, well, A, who's the issuer? Who's the promoter? It doesn't fit in our current, it doesn't fit into our current framework. That was first, second point. And then the second point was, and by the way, who is the managerial team? Who's working on these kind of things? So let's go for the first time. I mean, it's true that, yeah, there is no issuer, but there's no promoter, but there are reasons why things are regulated. So this argument is a little bit, well, maybe you should regulate it anyway if you need to protect widows and orphans from making bad investments. But the second point is interesting because this is obviously something that is related to what they call the Howey test, which probably now everyone knows about, which is this like famous thing, which this is, okay, what is a security in the United States? And it's 4 criteria. It must be investment of money or later any asset. There must be an expectation of profit or a hope of profit. I suppose sometimes they lose money. Common enterprise, which typically means multiple people, and the profit generated by a third party. So that's normally like managerial efforts of others. So this is where Hinman latched onto, where he said, hey, look, there is no third party, or there's no defined third party. There's sort of like a community, but this thing, Ethereum just is. It is not managed. It is not something. So it's quite interesting, but to be clear, that is the view of a particular person at the SEC. I don't think this was any of the official views, and we'll see how legislation evolves there. And then, of course, state-level regulation is different, blue sky laws. It's not only the SEC that decides these kind of things. Now, of course, as we said, in the EU, the Howey test doesn't apply in any case. That's something specific to US law. So in the EU, they like to give definitions. Definition of the financial instrument, this is from my book. Well, what it is, look at the laundry list, section C of Annex 1 in MiFID II. Below, what is this actually? Well, it's transferable securities, it's money market instruments, it's units in collective investment undertakings, which is essentially fund investments, and then the rest is all kind of derivatives, futures, options that are sometimes in, sometimes out, and emission allowances. So this is what securities are, and well, it's a laundry list. None of it is cryptocurrencies. Well, MiFID II is a bit older than that. And so this is why also the German court said, look, sorry, but no one told us this is a security, so it's not a security. Having said this, so this point, transferable securities itself, is actually a bit funny because there's also a definition of this. The definition of transferable securities is also in MiFID. It's the same on MiFID 2, actually. And so what are there? There are four points. So transferable securities are securities. They're negotiable on a capital market, and there are no instruments of payments. So these are the 4 points. Securities, negotiable, capital market, and no instruments of payment. Now, instruments of payment is relatively easy. This is like dollar bills, mostly, this kind of stuff. And they're actually defined somewhere else. Negotiable is also sort of easy, because negotiable means that you can, it's a term of art in the legal world. So people know what this means. Securities, the EU actually doesn't define what securities is. But they don't have to, because this is an EU directive. The EU directive sits above the local laws, and they just sort of assume that each of the local laws actually have a view of what a security is, and it probably is more or less reasonable for what they're doing. But harmonization-wise, this is actually a little bit tricky, because the MiFID II interpretation could be different in the different areas. And well, on the capital market, this has been completely undefined. And that's an interesting question. They didn't talk about organized markets. Organized markets, you look at EMIR, you know what are organized markets. Capital markets could be just me and Antonis or whatever going to the cafe and just sort of exchanging bitcoins. We could argue this is capital markets. It hasn't been defined. So what I'm going to say here, what I want to say here is that whilst it doesn't obviously apply, it also doesn't obviously not apply, especially if you have some ERC20 tokens that behave a little bit more like equities, a little bit more like bonds, that you could actually argue that they fit the definition of transferable securities. But so this is really something that we need to see. Anyway, enough of this particular. This is just one tiny, tiny sliver of what regulation is about. Because if you look at, if you're a financial services firm, this is pretty much the whole spectrum of regulations that you actually potentially have to look at. I mean, something is more important, something is less important, but this is all that you sort of need to have an idea what to do with. So just to highlight a few, AIFMD, alternative investments. If you want to sell investments to a high net worth individual, you can't use it under retail. Typically, it's hedge funds, this kind of stuff. AMLD, money laundering, already talked about quite a lot. Consumer contracts, consumer credit, whatever. CRD is about banks. So this always applies, or pretty much always applies, when you commingle funds. You take client funds and you don't hold them in segregated accounts. If you don't do this, if you commingle them with your own funds, you must have a banking license. So CRD4 defines banking licenses. EMIR, market infrastructure. So if you run an exchange, you probably need to look at EMIR, because it's sort of, that's what exchanges have to do. This is about clearing these kind of things, especially if it's derivatives. And it's about regulatory reporting. GDPR we had. MiFID II I already talked about. This is all about investments. Prospectus directive is another interesting one. The only thing that I want to say about that, though, is that a white paper is not a prospectus. So there are differences. PSD2 is about payment services. And this is mainly, now the key thing is that banks have to actually provide APIs, and then specific institutions can latch into these APIs. And this is in particular account information service providers, AISPs. This is people who read your bank account on your behalf and give you all kind of cool information. And PIS, payment initiation service providers, who sort of provide you easier access to make payments. The one that I left out is the e-money directive, because this is actually a surprisingly important one. It was initially meant more like, well, you have a cool payment card and whatever. You don't hold the money yourself. You hold it in segregated funds, but you provide these kind of, I hold money for someone else, allow people to pay, this kind of thing. But now, because it's sort of the favorite license of a lot of entities. So Monzo, Revolut started out with an e-money license because this is sort of the easiest. People think it's a bank, but actually they started with an e-money license. Now they have banking license, but it used to be. And it's also the license of choice of pretty much any crypto institution that tries to be regulated and deals with client money. So most of the crypto exchanges nowadays try to go for an e-money license because this allows them to hold money on behalf of customers, and then they can use this. So if they provide a fiat on-ramp, off-ramp, that's a license that they have to go. So anyway, so this whole thing there is really something that at least at a high level people should be aware. Generally, regulation, and Jeff already talked about this a little bit. Regulation has a purpose, and you can classify it for the purpose that you're using. And the four main reasons why you have regulation is prudential, so to keep the system safe, you don't want banks to fall over. Then it's conduct, you need to treat your customers fairly. Then it's about market structure, so you want to have efficient markets. And public interest, which is a bit the odd one out, which is in particular the money laundering regulations, which is not really a regulation, but you actually use your banks as sort of as an associate police force. So you make them do something that is in the public interest. And the important thing here is that you always, when you do regulations and when you do crypto where they don't really apply, you often have to go back to what does the regulator want to achieve, what are the principles, and what does it mean? All right, so when we're talking to clients, we often also talk about regulatory strategy because regulations is important, but regulations is huge, big teams and whatever. And so you need to think about, if I'm a startup company, how do I get regulated? And you can say, okay, I go very early, or I go very late, or I go in the middle. And obviously the sweet spot is always in the middle, but because sometimes going late, I mean, there's sort of, it's recorded, so I'm not going to say any names, but there's a well-known taxi company who's, well, not a taxi company, but whatever, you know what I mean, whose strategy was a little bit, well, you know what, it's regulated, but we don't really care. Let's just do our stuff and then let the regulations catch up, because regulations are stupid anyway. This sometimes works. It allows you to grow, it puts pressure, and it worked actually pretty well in their case. In financial services, this tends to be not a great strategy, I believe. Might work sometimes, but I think generally you should be a bit more proactive. Also, the problem is, when you get here into this swoosh where you take off in your hockey stick, this, if you haven't thought about regulation first, and you haven't been on the regulatory radar, and the regulators say, oh, wow, this is becoming big, so let's look at these guys. This is not when you want to start having the discussions, because then all your systems are going to fall over anyway. You don't have enough staff. Your CEO is going to be busy doing whatever CEO is doing when everything is falling apart. So you need to have your regulatory ducks in a row before this, this growth phase starts. So I would say generally the sweet spot is in the middle, but in a financial services company, rather a little bit earlier than a little bit later, if you want to make the scaling. Final point, and this is really something that sort of advises a chart from the book. This is really something that every company in financial services space really should look at. There's like 4 questions you should ask. So the first question is, are there regulations that do apply to our business? If there are such regulations, then obviously you need to comply. That's not even a question. The second question is, are there regulations that would apply to our business if we were on the regulatory radar? Sometimes you're too small, it's sort of not quite clear. Yeah, you should probably comply. You can drag your feet a bit, but maybe a bit later. Third question, which is the bottom one here for some funny reason. if you have a competitive, if you're working with other competitors, or if they're competitors in your market, traditional ones, are they regulated and we aren't? And is there a good reason for this? If the answer is no, sorry, you should probably think about being regulated a little bit later. And finally, that's about the principles. If I'm in the product space where I'm working, should I be regulated? Is the product, does it make sense? Are there principles like make money, protect widows and orphans? Chances you get regulated. Anyway, I see this blinking in red, so and I've been told to absolutely not run over. So I'm not going to run over, but I think I can take 1 or 2 questions, and then we can all go for lunch.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. You're going to have, OK, any quick questions?
OK, 1 question.
The boss says.
Make it count. Everyone wants to go for lunch.
OK, well, Stefan, it's lunchtime, so I'm sure Stefan will be available to speak outside.
I'm around until Friday.
Exactly.
Anyway.
So, yeah, it's now going to be lunch break. It will be out in the foyer there. Lunch will be available, and it will be announced when the next session starts. OK. Thank you so much, Stefan. Sorry for the quick ending.